please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and thanks to everyone for their patience. Oh, thank you. Patience with technology, always sort of a fun start of a talk. I think we get over our Zoom experience by now, but here we are. So this is actually a really fun talk. When folks here at the Bronfeneller's Center asked me to think about translational research, I was like, this is a great opportunity to go back to work that I have done in the past. And I say this because I actually am doing a lot of very different work now, but I'm going to pull back into the past and with pieces that I'm touching on in the present in order to help you see some of the translational efforts that I have undergone and the struggles that I've faced trying to do different aspects of translational research. So where I'm going to begin is the story of how I ended up studying teenagers and young people using social media, which is I grew up as a queer kid in rural Pennsylvania, and I found chat rooms on the internet back before people realized they might be scary, and I found them to be truly a saving grace. They were a place where I found community, where I found connection, where I found people who were willing to listen to a really confused young kid ask really stupid questions, and it was a really supportive environment. And so that was sort of my early day experience of the internet. And it prompted me to go to college and study computer science, where I ended up spending a lot of time trying to visualize relationships and structures. And when I was in grad school, still doing visualization work, there was a website that came out, a website known as Friendster, which anybody who is not young in the room might remember. This was like a precursor of Facebook or all of the other sort of later ones that would come. But the idea was that you could identify yourself and build these online profiles. It's the beginning of what we called social network sites. And I was really excited because the thing about these early social network sites is that they took on the same logics of nearly every major early technology, which is that they were widely embraced by self-identified geeks, freaks, and queers, of which I was all three and very happy to be in my home element. And so this was a great, fun environment, again, seeing different things. But at the time, I started getting to pay attention to what the tech industry was thinking about this. And it led me into a lot of different places where I started trying to understand what was coming to the kinds of online environments that were happening that I grew up with. And by that point in the trajectory, many of the online queer environments had been invaded by people who were really determined to be really cruel to people who were coming out as queer, specifically young people. They became very, very toxic environments. And I was like, this is really, really fascinating. So that prompted me to put my dissertation to totally focus on what was actually happening, not for me as a young person in social media, but for everybody else out there. What were young people doing with these technologies? And so I ended up embarking on my dissertation project, which turned into my first monograph, whose title is It's Complicated, which is one of those titles that you're not supposed to be allowed to say because it turns out that your editor wants you to keep saying, and it's complicated too, and it's complicated also here, and it's really complicated there. But, I was stubborn, and that was the title I gave myself at the time. And so the book actually talks about all sorts of different perceptions of things we imagine about young people and technology. And so I go into different kinds of like what's actually going on around addiction, what's going on around bullying, what's going on happening around predation, all of these different topics at the time, and sort of unpacking the dynamics. And if you want to talk about the book, we can. But I came out of that book with three really important meta takeaways for myself. One was that anxious parents were really focused on the wrong things. And I found this really frustrating. Second was that there were serious mental health issues that young people were facing. But once again, people were looking at them from the wrong direction, and therefore their interventions were not being helpful. And three, I learned working amongst scholars who were studying young people that I should not study young people while I had my own children. That this tended to go poorly for those young children. And so those were my meta takeaways. And so I decided, what would I do about it? The first thing I did was I really went on a big book tour and did a lot of really sort of concerted efforts to work within different communities. And really the lesson I came away from that was that I didn't know how to convince parents to be less anxious, right? And I put this on me because I was really struggling. And I found actually that working with a lot of translators was much more effective. So I spent a lot of time training the trainer and really helping different kinds of educators and people who were doing outreach into schools understand what the data looked like. But I also just found myself being a really impatient interlocutor with parents who I was just like, talk to your kids, and that was not the right answer. And so then, I also, part of it was that whenever I would talk to parents, they would immediately repel some of the things I say. They're like, well, you don't yet have teenagers, so you don't yet know. Talk to me again when you have teenagers. And I was like, eye roll, also not helpful. So I decided instead to put my energy somewhere else, which is that rather than spending most of my time focusing on doing another research project, I actually spent a lot of time really, by that point, seeing what the mental health landscape looked like. There was phenomenal research out there. And there was a really big gap between what was happening in the research and what was happening in terms of services that young people had to get support. And so I embarked on a project and helped found a mental health organization. I was a board member in the founding position, but spent a lot of time doing the translational research into that organization with a very simple question, which is that young people actually aren't calling hotlines, right? They don't know who to turn to. They want somebody to talk to. They need it to be anonymous. They need it to be confidential. And they need it to be available at 2 a.m., right? Because it turns out that young people's mental health crises do not happen between 9 and 5. And so we embarked on this project and created Crisis Text Line, and we'll talk a little bit more about it in this talk. But I'm very proud of the work that we did, in particular how we worked on taking a lot of knowledge of what was happening about mental health and translating it into practice on the ground with the work that we did in terms of training the counselors, in terms of other sort of on-the-ground material. Meanwhile, I did stop studying young people because I focused on raising my 3 young people. I realized part of the best thing about doing research for so long in this space was I realized my kids were going to be fine, right? Like, they had so many opportunities that so many of the young people I talked to never had. They were going to have their ups and downs. Of course they did. But they're pretty awesome, and I could support them, and I didn't have to be panicked about everything. My kids are now 8, 10, and 12, and if you're curious, yes, they have phones, and I don't really want to study them, and they really don't want me to study them. And so, this is one of the places where it's been really frustrating because they've gotten to listen over the last couple of years as I put fingernails to chalkboards every time I hear different kinds of large media coverage about kids these days. And bless my kids, because they sit there and try to correct the things that they hear and then give me feedback of everything that's going on in the classrooms, which is really adorable. And more importantly, my friends who do still study teenagers regularly call them up, and they sit and tell them all the deets about all the things they've got wrong as researchers. It's pretty phenomenal. But I keep telling them that I won't study them. But still, I'm at a point right now where I'm warily stepping back into this space. I say warily because I am so tired of the fear-mongering that is at play right now. In particular, we're watching as 2 very well-known psychologists have been taking correlative data, making causal claims, and bullshitting their way through million-dollar book contracts to result in telling stories that are actually driving fear rather than actually grounding and helping young people in order to push various political agendas that aren't public. And so despite not wanting to get back into the space, I'm now back to looking for places, not necessarily where I need to do original research, but where I can serve in a translational role in a way that will be powerful. But please don't tell my children, because they'll be pissed. All right, so let's talk about one example of this. Let's go back to the crisis text line example, because it's a really interesting one in trying to understand that marriage of what's going on, both for me as a researcher and what I'm trying to make sense of, the translational research and the raw practice of helping young people in a crisis. And for me, this interesting moment happened in March of 2020, right? I think all of us can remember there was a lot going on in the March of 2020. One of the things for me that was super interesting is I was able to sit on the dashboards inside Crisis Text Line, seeing what was coming in inbound. And we were sort of knowing that we were preparing for a storm. And I say that because one of the things about crises is they have very notable patterns when you deal with mental health. And one of the kinds of patterns that we learn to recognize is when we have an incident, a public incident, how fast is going to be the onslaught of attention. Now, in March of 2020, we had a lot of volunteers coming in to help us, but we didn't have as many people that were in acute crisis because we knew we were going to be hitting that in about 6 months. And to give you a sense of this, it's important to realize that when a celebrity dies by suicide publicly, it's all hands on deck that night. But when we're dealing with something that is much more like COVID, or like, for example, a wildfire, we've got a 3 to 6 month lag. and when we're going to hit crisis, because it turns out people go into really automatic coping mechanisms in that immediate moment. So you start having a timeline where you prepare, and you prepare. The challenge is, of course, as people go into crisis in a community, it is also the time when the volunteering and the willingness to actually spend hours there is going to go down. So you really have to prepare when you're trying to serve people in particular ways. And so adrenaline got people through that first chunk, and we were spending all of our time figuring out how to mesh this. So as we started bracing for that spike, there were many things we could get our heads around, and we were prepared for by prior experiences, but where there were certain things we were not prepared for. Now, keep in mind that when we're doing crisis work is spectral, right? And we can talk about people who had a really crappy day because the boy at school was mean to them, right? Which is like, it sucks, and it's really real, and it feels really emotional, all the way to, I am in the middle of an active suicide situation, right? And so we've got a full spectrum that we have to work through, and we can talk about the technical work about how crisis text line works. But for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to get into the specific aspects of those who are in the middle of an active suicide. When you're in the middle of an active suicide situation, your first goal is to get rid of the means or the mode by which that person might die, right? So you want to get rid of the gun, get the bullets out of the gun, get rid of the pills, anything you can do to minimize the likelihood of completion at that moment. And we, again, this is well established. We know how to do this. There's different practices. It doesn't always work. When it doesn't work, that's when you call in active rescues. But we have a sense and protocols around handling this. But the critical thing that broke down for us during COVID was the second stage of that process. Once you get through or get rid of the means at that moment, your next move, you're not going to solve the underlying problem in a crisis situation. Like, that's not reasonable. What you're really focused on doing is figuring out a plan for the next 24 to 48 hours, right? So you want to take that person and help them imagine how they're going to take action for the next 24 to 48 hours, and in particular, how they make certain to anchor themselves with people that love them, right? People who want them to be alive. And in that process, there are critical people you're turning to, right? When you're talking about a young person, you are not prioritizing their friends. You are also not prioritizing their parents for reasons that we will get into. You are prioritizing different versions of non-custodial adults, right? Now, non-custodial adults is the aunties and the coaches and the pastors and the mentors and all of these different people that play a role. Those are critical players in your crisis. And I didn't immediately realize what problem we were going to have in COVID, but as you can probably see in setting this up, here was our problem. Kids are at home, alone. They don't have access to anyone. They can't imagine how they're going to get out of the house in the next 24 hours, let alone find somebody that they can talk to without being overheard. And we went, shit. So one of the things we kept coming was over and over again, we're hearing from young people, I don't have anybody, I don't have anybody. And when we cannot actively plan for the next 24 or 48 hours, we are calling emergency services. Right? And when we're calling emergency services, when we are lucky, that involves a mental health expert. All too often, that involves a cop knocking down your door. That is not a thing you want to do. And so it's a very difficult challenge of trying to make that decision of when do you risk sending out a cop to somebody's house. And the other thing is that when we call, we don't know if we're going to be sending out a cop or a mental health. We're calling 911. Right? So that's sort of this interesting trick in figuring this out. I expected this problem to recede after COVID, after people got back to school. I was wrong. This problem actually only got worse after COVID. And it kept getting worse, and it kept getting worse. And so we spent a lot of time trying to figure out what the heck was going on. And this led me to return to my data from a decade prior. So when I was working on my dissertation in 2004, when I was working on my dissertation in 2008, I ran across an amazing report in 2004. And the report was written for the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, which I love that there's a Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. But the guy who wrote it, his name was William Byrd, which I'm like, dude, how did you get this assignment? This is amazing. And he highlighted work in the UK talking about how children had lost the right to roam over multiple generations, really looking since the 70s, and how he was interested in it from a nature perspective, how disconnecting youth from nature had negative impacts on their mental health. Not particularly surprising. Except, of course, when I was interviewing teenagers, in both the aughts and the tens, what I heard over and over again was how unable they were to interact with anyone out in public, how they couldn't get out on a bike and just roam and be home by dark. Over and over again, they kept telling me all the reasons why they weren't allowed to go out, right? And a lot of it came down to different forms of fear. And so the result is that teenagers were telling me all the ways in which they were turning to technology to make up for their ability to go out and engage with social media. Friends were the draw to the technology, not the technology itself. But what I hadn't noticed when I did that original analysis and when I talked to them, and by the way, the problem has been going on since the 70s, so anybody who tells you that kids lost the right to roam in 2014, that's not true. So this has been going on for a long time, and it has different flavors to it. But what I didn't notice at the time, and I did when I went back during COVID, was that young people were also telling me how they had lost the ability to hang out and talk to adults in their world. And I had all throughout my field notes, all of these different notes of it that I didn't pay attention to at the time. You understand as a researcher, sometimes we have to carve what we are studying, and so I just wasn't really attending to this. But they were talking to me about how sleepovers were off limits because these other parents might be predators. They were talking about how you shouldn't trust neighbors because they are strangers. They were talking to me about how they could only interact with adults in very scripted environments where they had gotten all of these official approvals, etc. And this was worse in certain environments than in others, but it was all over the place in different things. Now, keep in mind, at that time, sexual predation was the dominant narrative. So over and over again in this data, what I was seeing was that sexual predation narrative. But the result is that young people were telling me it wasn't just that they couldn't access public life. It wasn't just that they couldn't hang out with their friends. They couldn't actually interact with other adults. And so one of the things is at that time, teenagers were still talking about coaches and teachers. One of the fascinating things about MySpace, before the sexual predation narrative kicked in with that particular service, was that teachers were regularly talking to their students through MySpace until the schools blocked it. Facebook, professors were talking to students across, potential students over Facebook until that became not kosher. So all of these things had shifted, and again, I had noticed them at the time, but I hadn't paid attention to them. What I hadn't realized until I went back to all my friends who were still studying these topics is that even the idea of a coach, even the idea of having teachers as your anchors had been disintegrating subsequently since the 2010s. Coaches have become a source of high pressure as sports have become a source of ways to get into college rather than something that were just lovely and wonderful. Meanwhile, teachers had also become under pressure. I mean, teachers have been under more and more pressure, in every direction imaginable for decades. But this was also playing out that they were under pressure to not interact with students. And this only got worse after COVID. Basically, young people returned after COVID to school, and the coaches and the teachers were no longer had those bonds and did not overwhelmingly repair them. Because the teachers were also not doing well, right? Let's be clear. Like, they were struggling in different ways. And so it wasn't just that teachers had, or teenagers had lost the right to roam, they had lost all of these access to all of these kinds of mentors that would make a big difference in their life. These are the frontline defense for when teenagers are struggling. These are the people that look out for teenagers and be like, you doing okay? And these are the people that they are most likely to turn to when they're in crisis. And they had disintegrated. Okay. We take social fabrics for granted. We take our relational structures for granted. We throw a bunch of students onto a college campus and assume they will just make friends and everything will be great. But we don't recognize the actual cultivation process of this. And when it comes to young people, we do not recognize the role that adults play in normalizing sociality, in making it just a totally acceptable part of life. And we end up these moments, we have a lot of trends that have collided over the last couple of decades that have very much affected our social fabric, right? We usually talk about this as polarization, or we talk about this, as being too busy in different ways. We talk about stress. We talk about all of these different things that have happened, and we usually blame technology. But I want to point out some of the trends here that are not technology driven, that are really costly to the social fabric when it comes to the lives of teenagers. Let's start with intensive parenting. Intensive parenting emerged alongside the constraints to children's freedom, again, in the early aughts most notably, although it predates it. And for those who aren't familiar with intensive parenting as a term, it's the idea that parents should devote a significant amount of their time and energy to nurture their children as their top priority. That has become the idea of good parenting. And if you are a good parent, you will produce good kids. In practice, it means that parents devote an extraordinary amount of time to their children at the expense of everything else, including friendship, including mental health, including self-care. Now, there are variations of intensive parenting, and even those who do not, aren't aware of them, they often think of intensive parenting only as the things on the outlier levels. So attachment parenting is an approach of intensive parenting with young people, but it is only a subset of it. Attachment parenting is the idea of never letting your child out of your physical contact or out of your physical presence. And that is increasingly common in upper and middle class environments. At the teenage stage, it turns into a form of helicopter parenting, right? And we, of course, as college professors, have seen variations of helicopter parenting, where what you have is parents are always there wanting to sort of support their child and trying to be helpful, even in this moment of failing to allow them to negotiate with other people in their world. But most forms of intensive parenting are what we think of as common sense parenting in middle upper class America at this point. Now, most discussions of the problem do tend to focus on whether or not young people can grow up to be independent, right? If a parent is calling their professor to fix their grade, can a young person actually learn to negotiate their own world? The Surgeon General under Biden actually issued a warning more generally about the cost that this had to parents, not just to kids, and pointing out that this approach to parenting has eroded the ability to engage in self-care. We see studies coming out, things that say, for example, that there's a friendship recession amongst adults and amongst parents. But it's also one of the reasons why we sort of see these kinds of pressures onto young people around social dynamics, because parents have created really unreasonable expectations of themselves, and as a result of the social environment that they have around them. Now, the challenge for me about this aspect of intensive parenting is it doesn't just affect the parents, right? It makes them feel guilty. They feel guilty as hell. Most parents these days feel massively guilty. But it also affects how they interact with their kids. They think they are being helpful when they spend all their time with their kids. They think they are being helpful when they don't allow their kids being independent. They think they're being helpful when they prevent when they're the ones that show up for the kids everywhere. They're the ones who walk themselves home rather than trusting other kinds of adults. And when I ask teenagers about this dynamic, I'm often told, like with massive confusion, that their parents don't have friends. Like, why would their parents have friends? Parents don't have friends. I'm like, that is a terrifying response. Because the other thing is that when I ask them to go deeper on that, they point out all of the ways in which, their parents, don't even like show them any interactions with other adults. They might see them, and then when you push at them, they start to oh, I saw them talking to people at the parent-teacher event. Or yeah, maybe they talked to somebody at my game. And you're like, this is terrifying, because it doesn't dawn on them that it's weird that parents are not constantly having friends and socializing without them. And so one of the things is that means that teenagers also don't bear witness to when their friends or when their parents are socializing. And I think about this a lot because things like dinner parties do still occur. Adults still do socialize, but they almost always socialize outside of the purview of their kids. They do it when kids are not around, so the teenagers don't get to witness this. They get on their phones and text with their friends rather than calling them, so you don't get to overhear things. And I think about that compared to my own teenage experience. My brother and I would totally like hang over there and listen to, long after bedtime, of course, to what, my mother was actually saying on the phone, because of course you were curious. That kind of dynamic is far less accessible to young people. It also means that young people aren't brought into those social environments. They don't get to see their parents laughing and joking and arguing with one another. They don't get to see that sense that friendship can be a totally normal thing. And if you look out in places where parents are hanging out waiting for kids, they are staring at their devices. Sometimes they are staring at their devices in order to record their kids, right? Which is what happens, for example, at games. But mostly they're just physically present without being emotionally present. So what teenagers are witnessing is that adult life has no sociality to it. Adult life has, lots of phone usage obsessively. And all I come back to is a 1980s ad that I used to love, which is a PSA of, I learned it from watching you, Dad. For the younger people in this room, this was an anti-drug ad that was like, this kid was being asked like how he found, I think it was marijuana. Where did you get this? Where did you get this? And the kid's like, I learned it from watching you, Dad. And I feel like in many ways, we are in the same place right now around technology and friendship. And it's very worrying to me. Okay, so what are we at? The thing about non-custodial adults is that they are needed now more than ever. We need them around to be supporting young people when they are in crisis. We need them to be a part of a broader social fabric. And too few young people have trusted adults in their corner. And so first off, I'm going to put out a PSA because many of you in the room are over the age of 30, not all of you, but please take a moment. Think about your own kids and the social relations that they have, and spend some time building and nurturing the aunties in their world. And if you are not a parent, think about when you can be the auntie in your neighbor's kid's world, in somebody else's world, because this is not something that can be regulated. This is something that we all need to take responsibility for. So this is one of the features or factors that technically has nothing to do with tech and has everything to do with tech in terms of how we narrate it, because we blame tech. But let's take a moment to look at different aspects of tech itself. Because one of the things that I've been intrigued by in talking to teenagers about, let's see what's happening here in a second. One of the things I've been intrigued by talking to teenagers about technology over the years, and at this point I've been talking to them for 25 years about their different aspects of technology, is that for the first decade of which they told me that their parents were completely ludicrous, that their parents were overly worried and none of this was real. These days, they tell me that all of the ways in which they believe themselves to be addicted, they reiterate adults' narratives. And then I drill into them and ask them, what is actually going on here? What are you doing? How is this playing out? I did this yesterday in my class. And they quickly go and talk about all the other people, all the other kids, they're perfectly fine. All these other kids are not doing well. And so what we get is this narrative. We've been living in this narrative about technology today. And it's impossible at this point to talk about young people and mental health without talking about technology. The challenge is how to navigate the disconnect between what the data says, what people's experiences are, and what their normative assumptions are, right? Because these are different parts of that story. And so I've long argued that the internet mirrors and magnifies the good, bad, and ugly of everyday life. Right? This is not to say that the technologies are not implicated in this. They are absolutely implicated in it. But in order to understand those implications, we need to understand where these disconnects are. And one of the places we can look at this is the dynamics of bullying. Okay? Bullying is a really tricky one because if you followed literature on bullying, you will get data that spans from the idea that 5% to 95% of young people have been bullied, depending on how you deal with the definition. For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to use the Olveus definition, which is sort of a canonical one that's been used for decades now, which is that bullying is psychological, physical, or social aggression repeated over time by people of differential physical or social power. And it's important to realize that this is a dynamic that we tracked long before there was technology. And so the dynamics of it are really interesting because when technology came onto the fore, people imagined that bullying would go through the roof. It didn't. That's not actually what the data says. The difference between what technology did and what happened and the numbers has to do with visibility. Turns out that young people get to bear witness to bullying because of technology at far higher rates than they did when it was just face-to-face. And more importantly, adults get to bear witness to bullying at far higher rates. But still, most people were absolutely convinced it's the technology, it's the technology, it's the technology. And the question was, how could we meaningfully study it? How could we understand whether or not this was what was going on? Well, we got a natural experiment during COVID. Turned out during COVID, we had this really interesting moment of kids being maximally online and minimally engaged in face-to-face encounters with their peers. And there were a handful of studies that were in the field. Most of them were qualitative. One was a quantitative study trying to understand bullying at the time, so they were able to capture the natural experiment. And it turned out bullying went through the floor. There was very little bullying during stay-at-home compared to anything we'd seen in school, because it turns out that the bullying we see online is an extension of the social dynamics of school. Are there exceptions? Of course. But the vast majority of it, qualitatively we hear from it, and we got to see experimentally, quantitatively, ends up being connected. We also see these really interesting temporal elements. It turns out bullying declines in the summer and during school breaks, right? It declines in different ways. It doesn't decline as much on weekends because it's still an extension of things. So it's important to realize how these things are entangled. I say this because we will never intervene by saying kids should not go to school. Although, I want to be clear, homeschooling has skyrocketed since COVID. And when you talk to families about why they chose to homeschool, the overwhelming reason is that their kids' mental health improved when they didn't have to deal with their peers. This is specifically true for Black youth. And I want to flag this because we have issues that are going on in school. And when we spend all of our focus on technology, we don't address where those things are coming from. Now, because tech is often involved in these things, it is not always the source of things, but it is an amplifier. It is a reflector. It does play these roles. The question is, how do we use it? Do we use it to make sense of the problem, or do we think it as the primary place to intervene on the problems that we care about? And I would argue that most of what we're dealing with, intervening at tech is not the best first move. It is a moment where we can see and track and make sense of and ask questions. But I don't think that when we go straight at tech, we actually get to the core of the problem. Now, I want to be clear about something. Tech companies sure do make it easy for the public to hate them, right? They are shitty. They are not interested in the well-being of youth. They are interested in their own bottom line. So I don't want to say this in a way that suggests that I am putting tech companies off the hook, because I'm not. I think that they are deeply problematic. They have become exploitative. But I don't think that this is about youth. And I don't think that when we regulate tech companies on the backs of youth, we help youth or hold tech accountable. I actually think there are ways to hold tech accountable, but it doesn't start with youth. So I flagged that because this is one of the big challenges I will say doing any translational work. Whenever I try to explain the complexity of what's going on about young people, I am just put into a bucket as justifying all of the big tech companies. And that is not where I'm at all. So one of the places that I tried to intervene, and the places where we often think of intervention as really important, it has to do with regulatory moves. Where can regulation make a difference? And back when I was doing all the work on young people and MySpace, I got the bright idea that I would try to be helpful to regulators and translate what I was seeing to them. At the time, 49 of the US attorneys general decided to sue MySpace in order to mandate that they implement a series of technical interventions, including age verification, so that they would age gate the site and not allow young people under a certain age to be there. Lots of battles between corporations and government officials that I didn't understand at the time resulted in the creation of a task force where they put 3 of us in charge of trying to make a set of recommendations about what we could see in terms of making a difference for young people. This was the result of this was the Internet Safety Technical Task Force. I was the social scientists. There were 2 other lawyers. One was a prosecutor who prosecuted crimes against children. One was a research lawyer who spent a lot of time thinking more generally about policy. And he really just was, I would say he was the one who could negotiate the politicians for all of us. I was the clueless young researcher. So one of the first things I decided to do was that I was going to collect all of the existing research that we had about contact, conduct, and content-related harms, right? So this is ranging from sexual predation, bullying, and pornography, et cetera. And it was a massive literature review, right? We broke it down in different ways. And I was really proud of it. I was also learning a lot in the process because I hadn't looked at those data sets in that way. And it was really transdisciplinary. People were coming at this from so many different angles. But the thing about the sexual predation work in particular, which was the center of energy at that time, was that there were about 300 different studies from different disciplines that were all looking at this question of the role of the internet and sexual predation. And what they found collectively, and this is interviews with people who had been arrested, this is interviews with young people, this is statistical surveys, this is content analysis, it was all over the place. What they found consistently was that this was not a stranger danger story, right? Of course, this isn't surprising, right? We saw the Catholic Church. This is a problem first and foremost with how the technology allowed for crossing gatekeepers. So let me explain that. The uncle that you wouldn't invite to Thanksgiving dinner, who wanted to talk to your kid, is like, your mom and I don't really get along, but I want to have a friendship with you, right? Warning sign, warning sign, warning sign, bad, bad, bad. These are the kinds of cases. The worst and the most heartbreaking were the ways in which dating apps were being used because men had found that the best way to get to prepubescent children was to date single mothers, right? It is awful. It is gross. There are a lot of interventions that need to be done, but it is not an age gating story. So anyhow, I go and I get this bright idea. I present the collection of data we have to the Attorney General who's in charge of this whole thing, who screams at me and spits at me and tells me to go find different data. And I was young and naive, and I didn't realize what kind of political situation I was up against. I was like, this is awkward. Still, we put out the materials, much to the fury of all of the attorneys general who lambasted us publicly. Shortly after our analysis went public, I started getting calls from reporters. Also reasonable, right? We get calls from reporters when we publish certain kinds of high-stakes research, and I shouldn't have been surprised. Perhaps I should have noticed that certain reporters were calling me over and over again over a period of time, but I didn't think of it. They were asking for more detail and more references, and that wasn't particularly notable. But one from Frontline sort of outs herself a month into calls to me. She's like, I need to tell you something. I was assigned to prove that you were falsifying data. You have pissed off a lot of very powerful people. I was like, ha ha, awkward. Yay for translational research. And so I was like, okay, well, whatever. This isn't that big of a deal. Now, of course, that attorney general who was leading all of this, who I had clearly pissed off, I didn't understand that he was running for senator. He was running for senator, and his primary funder were the age verification vendors who backed him in that. And he went on to be senator. And he was heavily financed with a lot of those groups, and he continued on this element. He actually commissioned a new commission to challenge all of our research, but he brought on researchers who are qualified researchers, and so they actually reinforced everything we'd done. So that was also awkward. But he still kept putting forward a set of bills over and over again, trying to put in age gating in different ways. Most notably, a bill called Deleting Online Predators Act, which actually I will say my favorite moment as a researcher. I had been brought in to testify on parts related to this bill, and I was trying to explain the different aspects of research. And I had announced on my blog that I was going to come do this, and wouldn't this be awesome? And so some of the teenagers I had interviewed showed up to the hearing. Bless them. And at one point, I'm getting grilled by the senator, and one of the teenagers from Connecticut, bless him, decides to stand up and start yelling at the senator, telling him I was right, he was wrong. Also awkward. This has continued on, and for the most part, we had a few years where that wasn't happening, but we are back with a new bill brought to you by the senator and his friend on the other side of the aisle called the Kids Online Safety Act, which is a way of holding technology companies liable for kids' mental health. And here we have a bill that is actually not quite about age gating, but it is about forcing tech companies to be held accountable for whenever kids' mental health is injured. And if you go through the duty of care provisions in this, that includes exposure to content that makes them depressed. I don't know about you, but the news is making me very depressed. So I'm very curious where this goes. But it gives all the power to the attorneys general in its original form in terms of who would actually hold it. Now, the interesting thing is that his co-sponsor made her intentions very, very clear as to why she was bringing forward the bill when she was asked to speak to a family community. Her goal was to protect children from the transgender, and that was her words, and because she believed that children were being indoctrinated and that this was the dangers of social media. So again, how do you actually fight something like this, right? And I've spent a bunch of time, I've written blog posts, I wrote an academic article dismantling the particular duty of care provision. I've spent most of my time working with the activists who have been really doing a great job, and I just give them mass credit for doing everything you can imagine to prevent the passage of this bill. They've been at it for over 2 years, and they've done phenomenally, but the bill's back on the table again with the next round of, it's baked into the next round of the budget. So we will see where all of these come from. And it raises a lot of questions about what it means when the goal with regulation, do they want to hear information? And my experience in this particular bill, COSA, is that nobody wants to hear data. They don't want to know what this actually can make a difference of. They have a political agenda, and that is either you're with them or you're against them. So I've spent a lot of time for the last few years being demonized for this. Now, I want to be clear, there are places where I think regulation can make a huge difference. I spent a lot of time really focused on youth mental health in a different direction, which is supporting the creation of 988. And for those who don't know, this is a phone line and a text line that anybody can call or text in English or Spanish and get help in a crisis. And unfortunately, right now, we're watching it be massively defunded in the current regulatory climate, but we were very proud of being able to get this passed. Crisis Text Line, which I mentioned before, is one of the back-end providers of this service. So I continue to support these in different ways. So what is the path forward? How do we start to think about this, and where is the translational opportunities? Where can we make an edge? Many kids are doing fine. Some are really, really not. And there's a lot of room to help people. But the question is whether there's political cover and how to move across that. My current strategy right now is to support activists who are doing everything possible to fight it, but to also focus on how I can help young people in ways that are less controversial. Because one of the challenges I'm also dealing with is the ways in which political operatives are starting to use families that are in a crisis in a way that's deeply political. And I will say that one of the hardest parts for me is watching politicians fund and political operatives fund and bring forward parents whose kids have died by suicide. And that is one of the most horrible situations a parent can ever be in, right? And I have so much empathy and so much love for those parents. And of course, I also know from research that it's complicated. I would say one of the hardest things for me was I came out and started talking about aspects of COSA. And one of the kids who died, whose parent came forward, one of that kid's friends came to me and asked me if I could correct the record publicly because that kid's mother was going forward saying it was all about technology and was not announcing all of the ways in which that child had been abused. And this is always an interesting question as a researcher. What does it mean when you actually have to deal with parental abuse? And it's one thing when you do report it in situ as a researcher. What is your responsibility when you're navigating a kid who has died, whose narrative and legacy is being used in a particular way, and whose friends are pretty pissed about it? And that's a really messy situation that I found myself in. And I'm not convinced I can counter a lot of those major narratives right now. I don't know how. If any of you have ideas, I'd love to know them. But I don't think that I can fight people who have a lot more political power to gain from drumbeating fear and telling people that technology is the blame rather than actually accounting for the community at all. So instead, I've decided to focus my energy a little bit elsewhere. Instead, I'm focusing on 3 things. One is that I really want to think about, except for the fact that I can't move the slides, is how do we think about strengthening the social fabric? Turns out it doesn't matter. So helping social fabric is good, and more good, right? And so I can convince people across any political line without having to go to regulators that helping to invest in increasing the social fabric makes a difference. So this is my first big question, is how do I start amplifying, and what is a strategy to build to really focus on improving that social fabric? And that social fabric can come in many different forms. We talked about the aspect of being good aunties, but there's also ways of making certain that people are more robust and talking to one another. And I know that there are many people in this room who that's a passion. But this is one of the places where I've been trying to think through. Another place that I keep focusing on is how do we actually invest in mental health infrastructure? And I say infrastructure because we need to grapple with not just helping one person, but actually building the tools. When I helped found Crisis Text Line, one of my commitments was that we would be unnecessary within 10 years. It was a nice pipe dream, right? Turned out to not be true, but I wanted it to not be true because I wanted to know that we had enough infrastructure that we weren't necessary, right? Having to host chicken dinners in order to fund mental health. And I think we also have to deal with some of the unintended consequences of our well-intended interventions into mental health. And so, for example, I want to raise up the notion of the Affordable Care Act. As somebody who was uninsured for over a decade, I love the Affordable Care Act. I am a huge believer in it. But dynamics around the ACA and Medicaid have actually complicated mental health for young people. Turns out that there are too few mental health practitioners. We all saw it when COVID hit. It's only gotten worse. Most mental health practitioners are not willing to take insurance anymore, right? And so young people are really starving for the ability to get the support that they need, even when they're willing to come forward. And to make matters worse, that if you're under 26, the probability that you are on your parents' insurance is extremely high. But that also means that if you go and seek mental health support, your parents know about it, right? And so when I look around this campus, I see young people that are not willing to go to the mental health services here because it's tethered to their parents in one way or another. And there are mechanisms on this campus where they can route around that, but they don't even know that. And they are too afraid of their parents finding out that they're not doing okay. So we've got a problem more generally than this. Oops, I didn't put the right title there when I edited. That's kind of a great one. Mental health of the tech industry. So this is Cory Doctorow's slide. It was supposed to say we need to actually focus on changing tech policy without engaging with youth. I actually think there's a lot to be done in the tech policy space, a lot. I think we've got a dangerous political economy that we've set up, but I don't think that it is about young people. In fact, even empirically, if you want to target the most vulnerable populations on social media, we should be targeting elder populations. The 65 plus are actually going through hell in harassment and theft and disinformation, et cetera, et cetera. If you're really worried about disordered eating, we have to deal with the advertisers who are targeting menopausal women, because that's actually where it's most acute at this point. But I don't think carving the world up by age is actually helpful. Instead, I actually think that what we need to deal with is building regulatory regimes where we're actually thinking regardless of the person. We need meaningful data privacy laws. They're critical at this moment. We need to regulate the advertising industry. We need to regulate venture capital. There's a lot of regulation in the tech element, but let's not do it on the backs of young people. And so at the end of the day, what I come to is that young people, I want them to be well. I don't want them to be a tool in somebody else's game. I don't want them to be pawns. I want to support them where they're at, and they need our help. And trying to do that translational research in a political moment like right now, where young people are property, and they are property politically, they are property. And for those who don't know, the United States is the only member nation of the United Nations who never ratified the UN rights of the child, specifically because we believe that children are parents' property. And we baked our census around this. We baked many things around this. So I want to point that out because it makes it very hard to come up against that as a researcher. But the question is then, how do we make sure we can empower young people? And with that, let's have a conversation. And I know we had to start late. I can stay a little later for those who are able to stick around, and I will totally forgive you if you have to run out or that you have to log off up there in the world.
Any questions in the room? I'll hand you the mic so folks online can hear.
Sure. Hi, thank you so much for coming. I wanted to ask about two things. One was the Kids Online Safety Act. I didn't totally understand the dynamic surrounding like why we're against it. Was it kind of just because it wasn't really focusing on the right thing? And then also, could you go into a little more about how the ACA and Medicaid as of now don't address mental health care the way it should?
So, yes, sorry, blowing through things at speed. So COSA, there's a couple of things that are wrong with COSA, and it depends on which stage of COSA we're at. In its original conception, it gave all the power to the attorneys general and allowed them to come forward whenever something they felt like it was harmful to youth. And it was really flexible on what that was, which meant that it was going to be a political weapon from the get-go. And the dominant things that were going to come forward were going to be, it was already clear both by Marsha Coburn's motes, but also by the attorneys general themselves. It was going to be anti-trans, anti-abortion. Those were the dominant reasons. So I don't think this is a backwards way of doing censorship, and I object to that fundamentally. Now, I will give credit. There are a great group of people who actually managed to get that provision out of it during edits. So I want to acknowledge that. What was left, though, is what's called a duty of care provision, which is at the heart of this bill. The duty of care provision basically says that we require tech companies to build the tools necessary to solve all of these really bad problems, right? And I agree, like those are really, really bad problems. But the idea that tech companies can solve them is ludicrous, right? I would love schools to stop bullying. They want to stop bullying. There is alignment there, and it's really, really hard, right? And so the result is that it's shifting to a techno-solutionist mindset to the companies as though they could if they wanted to. And I think that that's the wrong frame. So again, I think it's a political move, and it'll be a political move used for different purposes that, what we've seen in bills like this is that they always go sideways in how they're used. And when they're done on the backs of youth, I get very, very, very worried. And so there's a lot of questions of like, what is acceptable for youth to do this? And I don't want them structured that way. So the duty of care provision, and Maria Angel and I wrote a whole paper about the duty of care provision. So by all means, check it out. It's a lot more detail, a lot more words. But I think it's really important to recognize that when we intervene, we have to figure out how to intervene in a way that's actually tractable. So I want to also give a small comparison here, which is that we require seatbelts to increase safety. And this is usually the comparison that's made. But there's a difference between requiring seatbelts and demanding car companies design technology where nobody could ever be distracted, right? I would like people to not be distracted while driving. Awesome. But what does that mean in practice, right? When you actually mandate that and when you shift the liability in those forms. And that's where we're at. And so I have no problem. And there's interventions I want that have actually been blocked out of it. For example, I would like to see some blocks on certain kind of advertising. I actually think that a lot of the advertising that is targeting things with inspiration, disordered eating, is atrocious. I have no problems blocking those kinds of advertising. Needless to say, money interests who are funding the politicians don't want it to be targeted in that direction. So this is where I'm like, target where it's actually going to be effective. The other thing is that for me, focusing it on underage means that we have to collect a lot more data. We have to do a lot more surveillance of young people, and it creates a whole set of other problems. So there's other pieces there too. Your other question was about ACA. So the thing to know about the ACA, again, love, the ACA has a lot of requirements for practitioners, for doctors, mental health practitioners, in order to be, I shouldn't say the ACA in this one, Medicaid has all these very specific restrictions and elements. So people have backed out of Medicaid. Practitioners have backed out en masse. Likewise, depending on which insurances that we've seen the insurance costs rise, but this has not gone downstream to actually help with practitioners. So practitioners are backing out of lots of different kinds of insurance, not just Medicaid. Medicaid was first, it was sort of a warning sign, but we've seen the backing out of this. And so we already have this really limited number of mental health practitioners actually serving people who are insured to begin with. And that keeps declining and declining because of our economic configuration. So in our dreams of actually getting affordable health, we're failing at it right now if we actually look at it in those terms. So I don't blame the ACA as much as I blame like we didn't put in the protections in the ACA to not end up with this outcome. The other thing that's at play right now is that 26 provision. When many people were pushing for that 26 provision, which is that people could be insured by their parents, but we didn't think of the consequences of this in terms of the fact that their parents get to track everything of their medical activities. And we are seeing the consequences of that in mental health. And it's one of the things we see at Crisis Text Line all the time. When we try to get people to actually go and get services, they're like, they'll tell my parents. Right? And that is a big preventative block. So I want to see as another intervention the ability for young people to basically say like, no, my parents don't need to know about this. And so, there's different ways you can go about it. I'm a big believer of universal mental health services for under 26 period, full stop, no question. But, that costs money. I will say the place where it is most acute right now for those who are tracking the stuff is what's going on tribal nations, because their regulation around mental health is also much more intense because it's implemented from Indian Health Services instead of from other mechanisms. And Indian Health Services not only has been massively funded because we as a country never live up to our promises to the Native people, but it's actually sort of disintegrated even more over the last year. And so this is a population we disproportionately end up serving in Crisis Text Line in ways that are devastating because we have nowhere else to send them. And again, we are a crisis service, which means that we can help at a moment, not in a sustained way.
Thanks for that. Let me allow one question from online. We have, how do AI companions fall into this equation? What you've described also explains why around 70% of minors have had an AI companion. Is there a case where AI companions could be good?
Yeah. So I've been talking with a lot of people who are much more deep into the AI companion piece from different angles than I am. So I'm going to make my comments from this meta place of talking to them. So first off, we've got a spectrum of how people are treating AI companions. And let's acknowledge that the vast majority of that use looks like the same way you treat your dog, which is that you talk to your dog when you had a bad day and you get licks in response. And that is the level of emotional attachment people have to this situation, which is that the vast majority of people who rant into these chatbots, and we can see this empirically from the chatbot, the people who are on the logs, are basically fully aware they're talking. There is no cognitive dissonance. They're basically venting in a way where they're just being able to be heard. Now, think about all the other practices we do like that, like diarrheaing, right? There's a lot of different things. So there's a whole bucket that I am completely accepting of because I am okay with dog licks, right? Like, I think that's great. Then there's areas where you start to get much more worried, right? And some of those areas where we get much more worried, all right, are areas where, first off, you got massive sycophancy going on, right? Which is that everything is validated, everything is supported, right? This is your best friend who will tell you that everything is great. This is a terrible dynamic for anybody's mental health. And it looks like some of the costs here are actually not as much, again, we tend to focus on youth, but I'm actually worried about what it looks like amongst a lot of older populations because where mental health issues are far more manifested. Because one of the things to also keep in mind in this process is that when somebody is encountering these systems and they are already struggling with mental health, the combination is toxic. And we see this in a lot of different issues in terms of media exposure more generally. So with Crisis Text Line, we spent a lot of time trying to disentangle 13 Reasons Why. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the show, but it was an excruciating show. Basically, it opens up with a young person who dies by suicide and leaves behind tapes explaining their reasoning of having been bullied. It is a show, it was created with the idea of like, warning people about the costs of bullying. In practice, what ended up happening with the show is that those who were doing fine watched the show and thought that was really interesting. And oh my God, did the people who were struggling go through the roof on completion and attempt. Right? And we saw the most god-awful completion rates over 13 Reasons Why compared to any other situation that we've had. So I say this because in many ways I see these interactions of like when people are already in a bad place, these technologies are deadly. And so what then are also the ways that we're intervening with people who are not doing okay? The challenge is that the proposals are almost always to block people. That is not going to help us at all because people who are not doing okay, who are seeking this out, are in a totally different camp, right, than the people who are seeking the dog licks. And so I want us to deal with that aspect of it. There's another subpopulation that I think we really need to also be attending to, which is young people who are on the neurodivergent spectrum and are struggling in general with trying to figure out aspects of friendship and relational structures. I want to point out that that population has been massively underserved since COVID began, under-resourced in tremendous ways. And the loneliness dynamic for that population, both young people and adult, is also excruciating. So there's a dynamic of different populations that we're dealing with this in different ways. But I also want to be clear that for me, it's not the technology is showcasing and amplifying all these pieces, and it's very real. But there are these preconditions that we have to account for. And I think that, there's going to be so much effort on trying to regulate and stop, and this micromanagement is going to do nothing to get at the source of the problem. And so then my question is, what can we do to really get at aspects of these problems? I also want to put a big flag in here around media literacy, because it usually is the thing that people jump to. They're like, oh, well, we'll just do media literacy and people can think their way through this. Media literacy works when you've got epistemic alignment, right? Which is that when the kid in the classroom and the parent and the teacher share a worldview, you can do really reasonable media literacy. When you have disalignment, you tend to create an adversarial response to a media literacy exposure. So the result is that if the teacher is saying things that go against your parents, you have to choose. And that choice is usually the parent. If the teacher is telling you something and backing up the parent in a way that goes against your views, you hate them both, right? And so we have to deal with those kinds of alignments as part of it. So this is also this question of messengers and social support. So for me, it's one of those spaces where like we can do a lot more by making certain that young people that are struggling are surrounded by other trustworthy adults than we can by micro picking what an AI can and cannot say. Because I don't think we will get very far on that process.
Thank you so much. We'll wrap there. And please join me in thanking Danah Boyd for this amazing talk.